Hello and welcome to another Tag1 Team Talk episode, the podcast and vlog of Tag1 Consulting. Today we're going to be talking about funding open source contributions with Matt Glaman. Matt works with Tag1 as a senior software engineer on projects. He's also a top 10 contributor to Drupal for many years now. He's the co-maintainer of Drupal Commerce and a Drupal Commerce expert, among many other areas that he's an expert in Drupal. He's also a well-known author, publisher of the Drupal 8 development cookbook, and the maintainer of many popular modules, including PHP Stand and the companion Drupal-check runner, which we're going to be talking a lot about today. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it and excited about talking about this with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Wow. So at Tag1, we're major contributors to open source projects. And so we're doing this series, talking with founders and top contributors of popular projects to try and encourage everyone to do more to support the open source projects that they rely on and help more open source developers like yourself get funded and, to really raise money for open source. And so to our listeners, if you haven't already, please check out some of the other talks in the series, which include Marin Haverbeck, the founder of CodeMirror, ProseMirror, and Acorn, talking about, his getting his projects to sustainability, and Dries Bathard, of course, the founder of Drupal, talking to us about open source sustainability. We'll put those links in the show notes. So Matt, you kind of made, waves and some big news about a month ago. You wrote this blog post announcing that you're going to be putting development for these two really popular and widely used modules, the Drupal-check and the PHP Stand, on indefinite development hiatus. The idea that they weren't going to receive any more development or even maintenance until you received more funding. I want to dive into that, but first, I'm not sure that everybody understands what those modules are, the critical role that they play in the ecosystem. So maybe it's worthwhile just step back a sec. Can you just give us a sense of all of that?
Yeah, so I'll step back to, there's a tool called PHP Stand, and it is a static code analysis tool. There's another popular one for PHP called Psalm, but about 2 years ago, I was doing review on how can we do static code analysis for Drupal to, productize code reviews of a sorts. And PHP Stand was easier to integrate with because Drupal has oddities, we'll say, in how it does auto loading. So I wrote the PHP Stand Drupal extension, and the product that was going to leverage it didn't pan out, but it turns out that PHP Stand had a deprecations extension, which let you find code deprecations. And this was occurring around the same time that Drupal 8.7 got released, and the community was looking around like John Travolta going, how are we going to get to Drupal 9? We have all this deprecated code. So I wrote the PHP Stand Drupal extension, and we were able to analyze Drupal code and find deprecation usages. And I made a blog post announcing that, and then I actually got an email from Dries saying how cool would it be if we had a Drupal-check tool that would automate the whole thing, because setting up PHP Stand, configuring it, wiring up the extensions, it wasn't as easy as it is now. So Drupal-check was a wrapper around PHP Stand and PHP Stand Drupal to try to make a one-stop shop, easy way to do static code analysis. Well, this really caught on. Drupal.org has a Drupal CI runner that analyzes the entire ecosystem and checks the overall deprecation status. Gabor has integrated that into a dashboard on dev.acquia.com/ I can't remember the URL exactly, but it pulls in that entire output of PHP Stand and deprecation rules through this extension. I know countless organizations run Drupal-check in their CI process. It was added to, I think, BLT, the build launch tool by Acquia, has PHP Stand Drupal integrated into it to do deprecation checks. So it became a major backbone in the Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 upgrade process. And, most people use it to make sure their code, if anybody's upgrading, it is the one way you find deprecated code. Some people might say well, I'm not using it. I'm using the upgrade status module. The upgrade status module runs PHP Stand under the hood. So the entire backbone of our major version upgrade infrastructure is tied to this tooling. And yeah, so it's really embedded into the process. And now that we're ramping up development for Drupal 10, it's coming. It might feel like already, but we have to start planning for things. And Drupal 10 Readiness is coming, and that meant that the PHP Stand-Drupal package needed to get updated because it was currently built for Drupal 8 code, but we still have to test Drupal 8 code to make sure people can get from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 or to Drupal 10. And it's a really integral part of that ecosystem.
How much time are you putting into this? Forget about all the other stuff you do for Drupal. Just this, I'm curious.
So I'll tie into, there was a bug that made us, there was a fun bug that prevented us from upgrading to the latest PHP stand due to a PHP unit compatibility trait added in core. It uses on-the-fly class alias, trait aliasing rather, to see if you have PHP 6 or 7. Well, when upgrading to PHP stand, it broke. Like, you couldn't analyze Drupal code at all. It just broke once you upgraded to, like, I think Drupal 8.9 is when that class was added. So I spent at least 30 hours trying to figure out why. I couldn't figure out why, so I found a version of PHP stand that worked, and I pinned it to it. Well, then I received issues, and I wouldn't say complaints, but, there are complaints saying, they were nice about it. Nobody was mean, but in the end, it's still a complaint of, we can't use PHP Stand Drupal and the latest PHP stand. And I was like, well, I don't know why. So I finally sat down, I did a live stream of it, and I wrote about it in a blog. But that was I spent probably 15 hours just going through that. And then finally, a month later, I did the live stream, and I think about 2 hours, I sat down and I found out it was due to not PHP stand, but the PHP parser library that has an abstract syntax tree of PHP. It added PHP 8 support, and around optional attributes for traits, it broke the analysis of the class or the trait alias or class alias call. So I had to go all the way down to the stack. So I found out why it broke, and then I spent another 20 hours trying to understand how the PHP parser library works and the abstract syntax tree parser. I know in that blog post I mentioned, I have all the links to this stuff, and I wrote all the GitHub issues and tried to just dump knowledge. In the end, it got fixed by Nikita, who maintains that package, and I am so thankful because I had no idea what I was doing. So that release went out, and then PHP Stand updated their release and tagged a release, and then PHP Stand Drupal could depend on that and went there. So overall, this one bug that was blocking it, I spent at least 60 hours, and that's like not work time. That's like my nights, that's my weekends, because it wasn't, paying my bills. So like I was dedicating some nights. I'm like, I'm going to finally tackle this. Well, then I get grumpy because I stayed up accidentally too late. And the next morning I'm like, oh, I didn't solve it. And I didn't sleep very well because I stayed up late working on it. That's just one of the problems too. Like there's been a handful.
Yeah, it's I think this is a story that we hear from a lot of top contributors. It's such a labor of love, and I love you talking about it because I don't think people really understand the gargantuan effort that it takes to do these things. And so, is that ultimately why you decided to put this on pause, because you were working another full-time job just on this one module?
Yeah, it's I said, this has to stop. Like I knew that the wall was coming with Drupal 10 readiness. I was getting some pings in the Drupal 10 readiness channel on Drupal Slack. And I was like, you know what? Like I was at the point where I was like, I'm just going to unpublish the package. It was that it became like a toxic thing. Like I knew that I had this burden to work on it and make it work because it is the backbone of the Drupal major version upgrade. It's going to be used when we get to Drupal 11, when we upgrade any Symfony version. That I was like, I can't do this. And I needed to raise the flag and be like, look, if we need this infrastructure, like we have to do something. So I decided like, okay, instead of, going nuclear and like unpublishing the package and going underneath a rock and disappearing, I was like, I'm just going to make an announcement. I'm not going to work on this unless I figure out a way to pay for it, which luckily some funding has come through, but it's just one of the problems can be so hard and take up so much time that I couldn't just take my nights and weekends. I have 3 kids. I got a family. I want to spend time with family. I'm not single and young that wants to just code all night anymore.
Yeah. I think that's an important lesson. It's something that came up with both Dries and Marin is that, asking, a lot of, people working on open source either aren't asking or aren't effectively asking for money. And that's not the solution, but that's a really important start, is sort of crafting that ask and going out to people. So, you had been raising, a few dollars on GitHub. Can you give us a sense, you were raising a little bit of money, you made this big announcement and you were able to raise a little bit more money. Could you give us, some insight into how you were doing it, the tools, the kind of money, what changed after?
Yeah. So at first, I've tried to do funding for open source for a while because I also run Contrib Kanban, which takes Drupal.org issues and creates them into Kanban boards to make sprinting easier. And that has an open collective, and I've used that to help raise some funds to maintain it. Now, it doesn't require a lot of maintenance. Like it's a Drupal site with React, and it just kind of runs itself. But I wanted some way to like get funding. And Amy June has worked with camps to set up sponsorship packages for tooling. So there's like a few camps. I end up with like $250 here and there. And that basically covers the maintenance for the year. It's hosted by Amazy, and I just have to run Composer Update most of the time. So it covers my time to maintain it and keep the tool running. But for things that are more active, such as like any Drupal modules or phpstan-drupal and Drupal-check, like that requires a lot of maintenance. And that's around when GitHub sponsors launched. Because I know a lot of people used Open Collective and it seemed like a hit or miss. I was like, well, maybe GitHub sponsors will have more traction because it's built into GitHub. So I created that and made an announcement, and I've got a lot of initial sponsors by individuals though. And I was making about, I think 60, maybe that was in the fall. So about 6 months ago, let's say. And then that was making about $60 a month, which covers about 45 minutes of development. But you know what? That 45 minutes can get a lot. It can get issue queues answered. And what it really did is it felt like, all right, I was able to buy my coffee for the month, could buy 2 bags of beans and spend time in Drupal Slack knowing that, there's some benefit to it. But like I said, as the Drupal 10 wall was starting to come and I knew that this needed more, I put out another call. Or rather, after I made the decision to pause development, I received more sponsors. Undepal, an agency out of, I believe, Germany, stepped up and became an organization sponsor, which is $100 a month. And that covers 1 hour development. So that jumped it up quite a bit. And then Intracto from Belgium also did that. They're doing it for 1 year. So they became another organization. So I was able to jump from about 60 to 115 to now I think it's at $266 a month, which is amazing because that covers 2.5 hours of development, which once we're after this major maintenance, or once we're after like a lot of this initial push, that might be enough just to kind of put it in autopilot and figure out ways to do specific funding for features, which is some feedback I got. Some people are willing to pay monthly, but it's also good to have, here's the task, here's the estimate, how much will it take? So I sat and I did like a quick estimate on trying to get PHP Stand and PHP Stand Drupal and Drupal-check ready for Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 and PHP 8. I'll always get those tongue tied. And I was like, I don't know, 20 hours, $2,000, like $2,000 will get me enough time to work on these, get them maintained and in status. And then the goal was to figure out how to collect that money because GitHub sponsors doesn't let you do single one-off donations. So I signed up with Open Collective because that is what Open Collective is great at. For one, transparent expense tracking and donations or funding, but also for one-time contributions. That's kind of where things are positioned at the moment.
And that 2000 came from?
Yeah, so I set that as the goal. And then out of nowhere, I got a ping from Mike Herschel, who's one of the organizers at Florida Drupal Camp, that they had a bunch of money in the bank from the sponsors, like because a lot of organizations spent extra marketing dollars and they had lower costs. So they said, look, we want to fund the development. So I received $2,000 in sponsored development from Florida Drupal Camp to be able to work on getting the tooling ready for Drupal 9 and PHP 8.
So, talk about putting asks out there, giving concrete asks. I need this amount of money led to an organization, doing it, and, I don't want to say that you have an unfair advantage, but you're one of the top Drupal contributors. You have a very prolific blog. You have a lot of reach. I think a lot of people don't have anywhere near, that exposure, and that's just something to keep in mind for the people that are listening. I would think it's even more challenging for others to kind of raise this kind of money which, is a big problem. We need to raise more money, and it's crazy. So, Drupal camp, a lot of, some of that money comes from organizations. You mentioned earlier, you have a problem. I don't know if that's the right characterization, an issue with individuals funding versus organizations funding. What's your opinion on that? Should individuals be funding you?
I mean, I won't say no. Like, if somebody wants to tip me, like, that's fine. But there's a problem when I see $25 a month coming from someone and not their company, because that's their money that they could be using for themselves, for their future, for their retirement. Like, I saw somebody post on Twitter, like, oh, well, I canceled my cable bill because they wanted to finally cut the cord, but they talked about reallocating that for sponsoring open source developers. In my mind, I'm like, what is wrong with our ecosystem when, and somebody's saying, like, I'm going to better my future to, I'm going to use this money to fund open source out of, like, not like profits from their business, but like they cut cable. So now they've got spare change and they're going to put it to another developer. I admire that. But to me, that just shows there's a bigger problem where individuals, instead of necessarily taking care of themselves, are taking their excess and giving it to other individuals. And what we're going to see is this kind of round change. Like, I'm sponsoring Jeff Geerling, and then he's sponsoring me. I'm giving him $5 a month or 10, and he's giving me $1. It's like, at what point are we going to see this roundabout change that it's all fake? Not fake, but it's just the money is circling in the lower tier, but it's not funneling top down. And that's my concern. Is it just feels like it's great. I appreciate everybody that is doing it, but to me, that's not healthy. So it's not necessarily a problem, but I take issue with it because it seems it's like a, if all of a sudden you had like a rash and then you found out, like, oh, it's because I have skin cancer. It's a troubling sign. That's how I see it.
Yeah. No, I agree. The individual canceling their cable bill, that is disconcerting. I'm okay with, if you're a Drupal consultant and you're making a really healthy living off of Drupal, and you want to give back to some of the features and functionality that empower that, I don't think that's a bad thing. But I would much rather this come from the organizations that you're working for, because they're making a very handsome profit on top of that. And so, I know you've written a lot about this. What are some of your ideas? How do we move towards more sustainable paid work on open source projects?
That's a really good question. And I've been trying to think of it. I've been thinking about it before I even like started my own company and moved on to new ventures, is to, one idea was gated releases. This is where we get into like the WordPress plugin ecosystem territory. But the problem is, like, I don't like the WordPress plugin ecosystem because it is a pay to play. There isn't like an open repository of plugins. There's 10 ways to do one thing that you pay for. But I do believe in this idea of paid gated releases, that you pay for early access, or it's a specific module that extends something, so you pay for that special like sugar on top. But I think actually I've been reading about it, and the new way of calling it is sponsorware. I know the folks behind React PHP are doing this, Clue Engineering, where if you're a sponsor, you get access to these cool, innovative private packages. And then after a certain amount of time, or after a certain amount of sponsors, they open source it, or it stays private. Now they're doing this all through GitHub sponsors. There's another blog post I was shared with. It's the person who created, I believe it's called Livewire, and they're very active in the Laravel community. And that might be who even like helped come up with the term sponsorware, where it's get sponsors, write private code. After 6 months, it becomes open source. But by sponsoring, you get access to these fancy private features. And I think that's one way we have to do this. And that is a very icky topic in the Drupal community. So it will take a lot of discussion, because one problem I see is there's no infrastructure for this. So it's an icky topic for me because there's no accountability. That's why I don't like the WordPress ecosystem. The paid ecosystem in WordPress, because I have had problems where I've paid for something, but the quality's not there, and everybody has their own infrastructure for selling code. So I feel like it's something like how we have packages.org, and we have npm.js. Like, what if those had a way to buy a license in the package manager? Like that's what I'm seeing. It's like we need our package management systems to have a way to support licensing, not necessarily developers standing up their own e-commerce shop and selling code through a paywall. So that's one way that I was saying, like, open source is funded, or obviously the go-to is selling a SaaS. Open Social. Open Social is a Drupal distribution. They contribute, but the way they make money is hosting their distribution as a software as a service. That's what Centauro is doing for Drupal Commerce, right? Drupal Commerce is remaining the open source e-commerce platform for Drupal that's full stack or headless, but Centauro Commerce is the headless e-commerce platform that you subscribe to. But that's kind of the typical model we've always seen is you sell support or you create a SaaS, and then you have the open source code dangling out there.
But there really isn't the infrastructure out there for, everyone to create a SaaS solution. Like that works really well for Centauro because it's a really meaty product and they have a team that can build that infrastructure, so one of the challenges to people that are, providing fundamental contributions is it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to productize things. I really like this gated release model because one of the things I struggle with is that, one of the amazing things about open source is that it's open source. It's free, and that is what leads to proliferation. If we were to make it proprietary software, no one would use it. So it sort of violates a lot of the fundamental tenets of what makes open source so great. And the gated releases reminds me, it's basically the old enterprise Red Hat model where you have these advanced releases that eventually become open source. And so it's win-win. People still benefit from the current release, and the people that are supporting and funding you, get that. And so with that, so you would have to get that off of a different repository than Drupal.org, that special sauce.
Yeah, that's where I said, like, we need, like, I wish we had an infrastructure for it. Like our package repositories could have that built into it. Is, a gated release also, there's one other benefit besides getting access to, code, is you're ensuring development and stable releases. Recurring stable releases. Like if you look at a lot of Drupal modules, it's like, hey, the maintainer finally had time, and after a year and a half we got a release. 3 months later they're still working out, we got a release, and then there's nothing. Or no shame to the Drupal commerce community, but like in the 7.x branch there's a lot of like dev modules. Like half of everything ran on dev because things just never got a tagged release, because it does take maintenance time, right? It's not a lot of time, but to create a release is like a 30-minute process. Tag it, create the node, add release notes. But gated releases basically pay for that overhead cost, the non-developer time, and ensure that it receives, attention beyond just feature development.
Yeah. It helps address, part of the tragedy of the commons. Companies are going to keep taking and taking and taking because it's free, and they're not forced to give back. And I don't think that, they shouldn't give back out of the goodness of their heart. This isn't about altruism. It's about, helping them recognize the value that they're getting for, and getting them to pay for that. And when it is purely free, there's no incentive for them to do so. So it's about providing incentives and disincentives. And that's why I think the gated release model has a lot of potential.
Yeah, it's one of, out of the goodness of my heart, I like to pay my taxes because I know what it gets benefited to. But if my CPA is like, hey, we can save you money, obviously I'm like, oh, great. Like, let's find a way to do it. So it's one of, if there's a way to take advantage and protect your coffers, that's instinctively what you do. It's like a survival tactic of a business. But once it becomes a necessity, you're incentivized to pay for it because there's a reason to. Now you can justify the cost. Right now, it's hard to justify those costs. I'm sponsoring DDev and Lando. $10 a month right now. I want to up it up to be $100 a month for both once I have enough profit from my company. I'm not going to take my open source funds and funnel it there. But from my work and my profit, I want to bump it up because I know I cannot work without those. But if you look at their sponsors, there's not many organizations. There's a few, like hosting agencies are, because they've worked out deals to have like their local environments. But like, there's no company that could work without a local environment? And how many of them are paying for that? Like, do we really account for how much we get for free? So that's my other concern, is what happens if everything does get a gated release and then they charge too much. So I do want to find, like, then nobody can work. So like, I like the idea of gated release, but we need to find a pricing model that works. And I think that's where the economics of scale come into account. There's 10,000, like, let's say a module has 10,000 sites. If you even at that point, charging $1 a month would almost be an absurd amount, because, $10,000, like $10,000 a month to maintain that module, that might not need that much maintenance. So there definitely has to be an infrastructure discussion and then a pricing model one. One thing I thought would be interesting is how like in a continuous integration environment, how you pay for your build minutes is finding a way, like, based off your downloads. Now, granted, somebody's going to find a way to have to download the package less, but if there was a way to, like, find that usage and be able to, like, generate revenue off of that usage. There's a company out there called Tidelift that is trying to do something like this. Tidelift is more for, I believe, like, license and security compliance than solving, like, you downloaded this package so many times. But it basically pays maintainers to ensure that they meet their licensing and security compliance needs for the organizations using their software. Drupal and PHP, probably not as much, but like the Go, Rust, and Java environments, I feel like that's where it pays to have that kind of integration.
I want to see open source modules send companies a bill, like just an invoice. here's what you should pay us. You don't have to pay it, but make it seem pretty real. You also gave me a really great idea. Like, why aren't open source contributions like tax deductible, right?
They are, if you track it right. I know in Canada they do have an R&D, like, so there is like a research and development tax credit, but you have to log your time. You have to be very specific. It has a lot of overhead.
Yeah.
I believe the United States has one, but again, the United States, everything is based per state. And then it might even be per county. It's like now you have to know how to understand your state laws. And that's where you have to pay a CPA. And how many open source contributors are going to sit and how many open source contributors have their own LLC and a CPA? Yeah. How many are going to ask their CPA, like, hey, I spend 7 hours a month doing R&D or open source development. Can I write that off as R&D? Well, do you have to now prove it's for your business? Like, well, I just do it. Like, I got stopped at the Canadian border because the person next to me said, like, well, I do open source work with the company from here. And they're like, are you evading labor laws? So I got paused at the Canadian border. I was like, I expected this coming back to the United States, not going into Canada. But it just shows, like, open source is this gray area of, is it research and development or is it something else? Yeah, it's a really weird area right now.
Yeah. And open source, it's so much more. I mean, it's the norm. When we started working on this, not to date ourselves, it was, not something that a lot of companies embraced, and that's completely flipped, but it's still, poorly understood, generally speaking. So I know this is a very contentious topic, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, because I think about it a lot. Why, you talked about the WordPress ecosystem. Why not a module marketplace?
It's one that I would love a module marketplace if the Drupal Association ran it. So WordPress.org is a plugin repository, but if you need to buy a plugin, you go to the third-party site to purchase it. Gravity Forms is by Rocket, whatever, but you have to go through their licensing system, which honestly is fine. There's Code Canyon, there's ThemeForce, I believe Super Themes, who I saw just like renamed to like DXRP or something like that. They have their own, but I know to build like the trust factor on Drupal.org through the Drupal Association, is this a way we can fund our security team? Like, not only are we going to fund open source maintainers, but is it a way to pay our security team by having it be centralized on Drupal.org? I know a lot of us are all about decentralization, but sometimes centralization is a good thing for trust and for organization. Obviously, this would be a big ask to put on the Drupal Association, but let's say there was like some kind of some kind of module marketplace where there could be some kind of licensing. Is this now through the scale of, the economics of scale? Because think how many sites are doing it, how many people might subscribe. This could scale to be very large in terms of revenue source for the DA, for the security team, for module maintainers. It instantly becomes a way that we could distribute these funds to help have a thriving ecosystem.
Yeah, the DA is they do a lot, and their mission has expanded tremendously. When we originally created the DA, there was a firewall. They could not be involved in Drupal development. They had a very specific mission that was outside of the code. Mm-hmm. And over time, they've greatly evolved. It's not just things like conferences that they run. They're running Drupal.org and all of our tooling, and they're helping to, enhance modules. And I don't know that everybody understands that, because we made such a big deal in the beginning to say they don't do any of that. So, one, we're trying to raise the awareness of what the DA does. And, the DA is so strapped. So, I don't want to say they should do this, but like a lot of projects, are funded by enterprises through strategic alliances or, foundations where, the Linux Foundation has said, okay, we've solved the problem for Linux. Let's replicate that model for all the other organizations out there and sort of copy and paste it and provide them with the infrastructure to do that. And you see enterprises coming together to work on projects. And I think, having worked on this a lot at Acquia, through large scale Drupal and trying to get enterprises to support Drupal, my guess, I can't concrete prove this, but like, the companies that are contributing to the Linux Foundation sort of run projects tend to be more tech companies. Microsoft getting together with Google to form an alliance, or Intel. These companies fundamentally understand it. Whereas if you look at the users of Drupal, sure, there are the Teslas, some tech companies and the SpaceXs, but there's, predominantly educational institutions and media companies. And this is so far outside of their wheelhouse. And a lot of times it's, marketing teams and, not necessarily, the underlying IT teams that are driving the budgets for this. And so, I'd love to find ways to get these organizations more involved, but it's extremely challenging and time consuming. So, something, more along the lines of what you're describing, I think is more within the wheelhouse of what the DA is geared to offer. They're so resource constrained as it is. And, so that would be really cool to see them get more involved on that front. Do you see a path forward? Do you see things getting better? If we look 10 years from now, 20 years, is this going to be a solved problem, or is, open source just fundamentally broken?
I think it's going to get better, but open source is fundamentally broken. It's it's built upon volunteer work, but that's the amazing part, right? I got my start because of open source. I would like code as a hobby. I didn't think it could be a job. Then because of WordPress, I found Drupal, not gonna lie, found Drupal in 4. Whatever, saw the word taxonomy. I said, I don't know what that is. And I never touched it again until later on in my life. But like, because of WordPress, here I said about the plugin ecosystem, but WordPress is open source. Plugins are open source. I fiddled with that. I got my first job. Then I found Drupal. I started contributing, was able to contract, and now I've been able to make a life off of putting that hustle and contributing. But then once I shifted from just contributing to hustle to make a living to maintaining, that's where the shift becomes different. It's open source is fundamentally broken because it requires free time and volunteering, which can be okay because it does allow people to hustle and try to do more. Mm-hmm. But that makes it broken because it requires free time and volunteering at the same time. Like, it's a double-edged sword.
Yep.
But I think we'll find ways to help the people who find themselves from I'm just contributing to all of a sudden like in this vital role as a maintainer to a project that depends on many things depend on, to find ways to sustainably maintain them or like to fund them. And I hope we find a way that it's not like you brought up tech companies. Yeah, like look at Drupal. Who funds everything? The hosting companies. but they're the ones that have the most profit and margin compared to agencies. So yeah, if you look at like Vue.js, who funds it, it's big tech companies. It's not necessarily the agencies, but it's tech companies that have the margin, the providers. We'll call them providers over agencies. Drupal doesn't have enough providers to fund it like we might see in some of the other open source projects, because it's mostly agencies or educational organizations who already have a bootstrap budget as it is.
Yeah.
So I think it'll get better, but it's just, we're always going to be flawed.
Yeah, these SaaS and PaaS companies have amazing margins, right? I think, I want to shame agencies here a little bit. Frankly, like, they make a killing off of Drupal, and I think Dries and the Drupal community have done a really great job of incentivizing them to contribute code through the marketplace and ranking organizations based on kinds and levels of contribution. You're going to appear higher in the list, which is going to drive you more business. So again, it's about finding incentives and disincentives to enable you to contribute. And that's great. It's not, directly funding other open source developers, but it's a model that works that we need to grow on. But, Tag1, we have a full-time resource that we donate to the Drupal Association. We run all of the tooling. Like, we are not the largest agency out there. We're not small. We're around 75 people right now, but, there's no reason that other agencies can't be doing the same. And some do, but they're certainly making a healthy profit. And, the other thing I wanted to say is, contributing to open source is really, again, incentives for individuals. Like, there is a ton of incentive to contribute to open source projects for the reasons that you mentioned. It's better than a CS degree for a lot of people. You're learning hands-on in a real world scenario. And, the number of people that have, cut their teeth on a project like Drupal and now have amazing, well-paid careers as a result of participating in the community is awesome. So there's tremendous benefit in getting engaged and involved, but it's that tipping point. It's when, it's that small number of contributors like yourself that are contributing the vast majority of the code, the one percenters, even like the fraction of a one percenters that are, driving, 95 or 90, even 98% of what's going on in the Drupal community. It's a really small number of people that are playing a critical and important role. And, it can't just be Acquia funding them, because that's not healthy for the ecosystem either. You don't want one organization controlling the platform. And I think Acquia is cognizant of that. They don't want to be in the position they are, but they kind of have to be because no one else is stepping up. And so
I even called that out in one of my blogs. I was like, the problems I see with open source funding, individuals, and Acquia. And it does make me mad when some people are like, well, Acquia this. I'm like, they do try to be as, independent. Like, they try to, they're mindful. But I don't think people realize that if Acquia pulled their core development, like their funding of core developers, we'd be in trouble. And I mean, most open source projects are like that, right? There's always the one big one, no matter what. But it's just, we do need to try to get more players in the game. I think if anybody has time, read up on the Kubernetes project and how that's morphed from being the Google project to here. I believe now it's only 1/3 of the maintainers are Google employees. The rest are from other companies. Obviously, they have a lot more subsystems that can get maintainers. But, maybe that's one thing we need to figure out too. Before we figure out contrib maintainers, if you open up the core maintainers.txt, there's a lot of question marks, things that aren't maintained. And it's one of, I've thought about trying to jump in, but why? Why would I put that? Why would I do that to myself? Why am I going to add more stress? I'm finding ways. I am finding ways that I plan on trying to get more into core and other things. But that's a question. There's a way we can set up a fund. I believe we tried to do that before, where we set up some kind of fundraise, the Drupal acceleration program. I think for D8, to get D8 out the door, there was a program where organizations donated money and it funded core developer time. But that was a one-time stimulus to the arm of getting Drupal 8 out the door. But we need to find a way to sustainably do that over and over and spread to other organizations. They can't. And I think one problem too is it feels like it has to be big dollars, big chunks. 1%. If there's a way you could give 1% of your profit, even if 1% of your profit is 1% of your revenue, the economics of scale make it work. Like that little change could make it work. But the problem is, how do we let it work? Or how do we build a system that makes it easy for agencies to say, yeah, I will give $5 a month to help sustainable development. Well, we could probably pay like 4 core maintainers if we were to get every agency to pay $5 a month. It's just, how do you propose it, and how do you make it a justifiable business cost? So that way, when they tell their CPA, hey, I'm paying this much a month, they're like, why are you paying that when you should be doing this? Or their accountant, anybody in finance, you have to justify the cost, because otherwise it's like, no, that should go towards something else in the company.
Yeah. And again, finding those incentives, tax deductions, and other ways to get these companies to contribute. It's not that the companies don't have the money. The Johnson and Johnsons and the Pfizers, these are, Fortune 100 companies. They have plenty of money to, fund, the Drupal, and they're certainly using it pervasively. Every Pfizer website runs Drupal, and, they're probably the model for corporate involvement in Drupal. They're amazing in their approach. If other companies took a fraction of their model and applied it to the community, we would be the most, successful, and advanced project out there. And, I'm hopeful that we'll get there, but I agree. I think there's sort of a fundamental flaw and a careful balance, and it's not an easy problem to solve. We go too far and we stifle all the benefits and goodness of open source. We don't go anywhere near enough, and, projects fall over because they just don't have the sustainability. So, it's about finding that, walking that line. And I really appreciate you talking to us about this. This was awesome. This was really great. And we'll put some links in the show notes to your blog posts on this, which are fantastic. I read them all last night and encourage other people to check them out. If you guys like this talk, please remember to upvote, subscribe, and share it out. You can check out our past Tag Team Talks at tag1.com/Tag1 Team Talks. As always, we'd really appreciate your feedback on this episode, on ideas and topics for future episodes. You can reach out to us at Tag1 Team Talks at tag1.com. Again, Matt, a huge thank you for joining us today. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you for joining us.